The dusty frontier town of Blackridge was just waking when the sheriff's whistle tore through the air like a blade, freezing every boot step on the main road as a young woman, quiet, steady, and known by everyone for her honesty, found herself suddenly seized by two deputies and dragged toward the wooden platform in the town square. The people gathered quickly, murmuring between themselves as she was pushed into the center of the crowd, standing helpless under the rising sun while the sheriff proclaimed that she had been caught aiding a dangerous outlaw who had slipped past the militia the night before. Shock rippled through the townsfolk, some gasped, some backed away in fear, and some stared with a cold satisfaction that came from seeing someone else fall from grace. At the edge of the crowd, a broad-shouldered blacksmith shoved through with soot still on his hands, disbelief and fury rising inside him as he saw his only child held up like a criminal. But the sheriff ignored his protests, unfurling a scroll of so-called evidence, an old cloth stained with dried blood and a hand-drawn map pointing toward hidden passes in the mountains. The young woman insisted she had never seen either item in her life, but her voice was drowned beneath murmurs of suspicion and fear as the sheriff declared her under strict house arrest until further questioning. The blacksmith wrapped an arm around her once the crowd dispersed, his voice shaking as he promised her she would be cleared, that this humiliation would not define her, but deep inside, he sensed something far darker at work. That night he sat alone at the table while she slept, turning the supposed evidence over in his hands, and the more he studied it, the more wrong everything felt. The fabric was the wrong weave for anything the outlaw was known to wear, the map symbols weren't criminal markings at all but council trade notations he had seen years before when repairing their storage chests. Slowly, an awful truth crept into his mind: the council wasn't hunting the outlaw, they were hiding something, and his daughter had been chosen as the perfect distraction. She had spoken too freely at recent gatherings, challenging the council's new taxes and questioning where funds were disappearing to, and now, suddenly, she was accused of treason. No, it was no coincidence. As dawn bled across the sky, he made the decision that would shake Blackridge to its core. He packed a small bag, tucked it beneath the workbench, and walked out into the quiet streets with a grim purpose carved across his face. He stormed into the council hall without knocking, confronting the three members who sat drinking fine whiskey as if the world were theirs to command. When he demanded the truth, they laughed, mocking him, telling him his daughter had been too loud, too curious, too troublesome, and that the town needed a scapegoat to draw attention away from a silver smuggling scheme they had engineered for months. In that moment, something in him shattered. With a fury that could no longer be contained, he snatched the nearest lantern and hurled it onto the table, flames exploding instantly as he shoved the heavy doors closed behind him, trapping the corrupt men inside. Townsfolk raced toward the blaze as the hall lit the sky like a dying sun, but it collapsed before anyone could save the screaming councilman. And there, nailed to the charred remains of the doorway, the sheriff found a message written in the blacksmith's hand: "You tried to destroy my child's name. So I destroy your power. Let the truth speak now." Panic and confusion washed over Blackridge by midday, with some accusing the blacksmith of madness, others insisting he had merely exposed the corruption everyone had quietly suspected for years. The sheriff tried desperately to maintain order, even attempting to keep the young woman under suspicion, but the people, freed from the council's oppressive grip, rose up in unison, demanding justice and a fresh start. Charges were dropped, a new election was called, and townsfolk who had once whispered only in fear now spoke boldly, grateful that the lies had finally crumbled. In the weeks after the fire, the young woman took over her father's forge, determined to honor the men who gave everything to protect her from the shadows cast by wicked men. Travelers from distant towns arrived just to hear the story of the blacksmith who chose the unthinkable to save his child, and she carried that legacy like steel in her spine. Each evening she stood on the hill overlooking Blackridge as the sun sank low, whispering into the wind that his sacrifice would never be forgotten, and as long as she drew breath, the truth he died for would burn brighter than any fire that ever claimed a building. After the fire that took her father and exposed the corruption festering inside Blackridge, the young woman found herself living in a world that felt both liberated and terrifyingly uncertain. The forge, once alive with her father's booming voice and steady rhythm, was now silent except for the ring of her own hammer as she struggled to fill the space he left behind. Every morning she rose before sunrise, lighting the same lantern he used, promising herself she would not allow grief to turn into weakness. The town had changed since the councilmen's deaths, fear no longer hung in the air like smoke, and people walked the streets with straighter backs, speaking openly about the lies they had been forced to swallow for years. Yet with freedom came chaos. No council meant no order, and arguments broke out daily, land disputes, trade disagreements, old grudges flaring back to life. The sheriff, stripped of influence and desperate to cling to authority, tried to impose new rules, but the townsfolk rejected him, remembering too clearly how he had stood beside corruption. Rumors began spreading that he planned to restore control by force, and though many dismissed the whispers, the young woman felt an unease she couldn't shake. One night, as she quenched a glowing horseshoe and steam curled upward like ghostly fingers, she overheard raised voices outside the forge, 3 strangers arguing in hushed tones, mentioning the stolen silver the council had hidden before dying in the blaze. Her heart pounded as she pressed against the wall, realizing that the corruption hadn't died with the councilmen. Others had stepped forward to claim what was left behind. The next morning she visited the hill where she often spoke to her father, letting the early wind cool her face as she tried to decide what to do. She knew the sheriff couldn't be trusted, and she knew remaining silent would only allow wicked men to rise again. So she made a choice, one her father might have made himself, and marched into the square where townspeople gathered for a heated debate over rebuilding leadership. She stepped onto a crate, clearing her throat until dozens of eyes turned toward her. Her voice trembled only for the first few words as she told them everything she'd heard, warning the town that thieves and opportunists were circling like vultures, waiting to tear apart whatever peace Blackridge had finally earned. At first there were whispers of doubt, but then something remarkable happened. The people began stepping forward, storekeepers, miners, ranchers, each admitting they had seen suspicious activity too. It wasn't just a rumor, danger was creeping in from all sides. The sheriff barged into the crowd, red-faced and furious, accusing her of stirring panic, but the townsfolk stood between them, refusing to let him silence her the way he once had. By sundown the people united to create a temporary council made of honest citizens, choosing her as one of its advisors despite her protests that she was too young, too inexperienced, too shaken by loss. But the town insisted, her father's courage lived in her, and Blackridge needed that strength. As the torches burned bright around her that night, she realized something profound. Her father had given his life not so she would hide, but so she could rise. And now, with enemies closing in and the future of the town trembling in the balance, she vowed silently that no matter what came next, Blackridge would never again fall prey to corruption, not while she still had breath, and not while her father's fire burned inside. Hairtontown thickened over Blackridge as whispers of armed men approaching from the northern ridge spread like wildfire. The young woman stood at the forge, gripping the hammer her father once wielded, knowing the threat was no longer just greed, it was coming for control of the entire town. The newly formed council gathered in the square, frightened yet determined, and looked to her for guidance they never expected to need. She reminded them that fear was exactly what corrupted men depended on, and unity was the only weapon the honest possessed. By sunset, townsfolk armed themselves with tools, farm gear, anything they had, forming a protective line along the road. When the riders finally appeared, expecting chaos, they instead found a town standing shoulder to shoulder. Faced with a united front, the intruders retreated into the dark hills. As the torches dimmed, she felt her father's courage alive around her, proof that one voice, one stand, could reshape an entire town's destiny.